Hey everyone. It's been a while since I've posted any new content, so I'm back. Seems to be becoming a tradition, but we have a bit of a rainy day here in New York. So good day to paint, and thought I'd paint for you. Okay, subject will be this. It's very beautiful view across the lake in Central Park here in New York, where we see one of these classic Central Park West buildings looming up in the distance, the San Remo. Not an island, but a little jut of land coming in with rocks. Some people sitting here on the ledge enjoying a really beautiful evening here the other day. Well, it was pleasantly and unseasonably warm. Spring is not quite here, but it's wanting to come. You can feel it. So I want to do this view to kind of capture that atmosphere of hope and budding joy and new things on the way, rebirth. But also technically, I wanted to use this as a subject to talk about how we can take what we look at in the world, paint what we see. By that I mean paint our experience of what we look at. And that gives us the liberty, that attitude gives us the liberty to be able to change things that we look at, things we can add trees or move buildings, change colors, change lights, etc. I really think that's the artist's job, honestly, to interpret the world, not just copy what we look at. Also, often, if you don't paint always on site, often we're reliant on reference photos. And while in general that's okay, in the specific, it can be a bit of a problem because you can begin to think almost subconsciously that just because it's in the reference photo, it must be accurate or can't be altered or messed with. And if I have any message at all, I'm saying not only can it be, it almost should be messed with, but certainly it can be. The downside, one of the downsides of these digital photographs, which most all of us can take on our cell phones, is they're great quality in terms of resolution, but you don't have, as a photographer, you don't have a lot of options to change, to make adjustments. So what I'm saying is that often things in the distance, for example, look just as important, just as hard-edged, just as saturated as things in the foreground. So a digital photograph can often have this very flat, one-dimensional feel to it. So if you want to use this as a springboard for painting, all well and good, but it's going to probably require some redesign in order to make a good painting out of it. And that's really the topic of the demonstration I want to do for you today. How you can take what you look at or what might show up in a reference photo and how you can redesign it a bit or just manipulate it even just in order to make a better painting. The time of day that I took this photo 2 days ago was early evening, so there's still a glow, quite a lot of light in the sky, but the buildings in the background are not picking up a great deal of direct sunlight, so they're looking a little silhouetted against the lighter sky behind. Great way to show evening skies is to not necessarily make them that dark, but to make the things that intersect them, that interrupt that lighter tonal sky, to make them darker than the sky. Because as the sun goes down below the horizon a bit, the objects that stick up above the horizon are not going to be picking up that much direct sun. So the point being, you don't always have to make the sky really dark in order to tell the story of nighttime or evening. Now, in almost all my paintings, I build them as a construction of shapes of value. 3 basic values: lights, darks, midtones. In watercolor, the light is provided by the surface of the paper. So I'm asked often, how do I paint light? And really the answer is I don't. I reveal it. As an artist in watercolor, we don't paint light. We just expose the light that's already there. We reveal it. And we reveal it by painting shades and shadows that make the light more obvious, more prominent. So given that, the tonalities and colors we select for shades and shadows deserve a lot of attention. They're not always just relentlessly gray and dull. They can be quite luminous, but getting a bit ahead of myself. When I'm trying to design a painting based on a reference photo, for example, as I'm doing here, I'm reminded of the obvious, that we're painting on a flat 2-dimensional surface. The paper is flat. It has only 2 dimensions. We have height and we have width. So anything we can do to imply the 3rd dimension, depth or perspective, is not required of us, but it's definitely something we might want to consider. I think that's one of the great beauties and compelling mysteries of painting, is that a viewer can joyfully, happily suspend their disbelief and feel they're looking at a 3-dimensional scene, when of course everyone knows it's just paint on a flat 2-dimensional surface. Again, that's obvious, but I just find it magical when it works well. And in my work, I play around a lot with that trying to imply the 3 dimensions within the 2 that we are given. So a couple ways of doing that. Linear perspective in our drawing is one way, using the horizon line, vanishing points, all that. And yeah, I employ that quite a lot. But I think a more expressive, maybe more poetic way of implying depth and perspective comes with layering of values. So again, I design most all of my paintings by using 3 basic values: the dark, the light, the midtone. And then I more or less assign them spatial areas in the painting, if you will. So perhaps you could have dark in the foreground, light in the midground, midtone in the background. That's what I'm doing here. There's not anything in this painting that's going to be right in the immediate foreground. I'm considering this little jut of land to be the closest thing we have to the foreground. I'm going to make that darker than the photo indicates. And then I'm going to lighten up the background, not really light, but mid-toned, so that it will recede. A darker tone in front of a lighter tone automatically makes it feel in front of, and automatically starts to set up that illusion, that feeling of depth. This bit of reflection and light on the water running right along the x-axis, I'm going to save as almost solely unpainted, a lot of it anyway. So that will be 1, my lightest light. Pretty much the whole background will be tones of midtone, lighter midtone to darker midtone. There'll be little glints of light, probably in the lower portions of the sky, maybe almost as light as this, but not quite. But for the most part, the whole background will be variations on midtones. And then, as I said, the foreground, or the distant foreground element, the trees, this bit of land, rocks I'll show here, and part of the reflection into the nearer bits of water. will be the darkest dark. I want to be clear that this is not the only way to design or arrange values in a painting, but it's one way that will work. You can have the darkest element of your painting in the distance. It's a little trickier, but it can work. You can definitely have it in the midground. But this is a value design I do rely on quite a bit, and it works quite well to establish that illusion of depth. The other thing, in the very near foreground, I'm going to tone the water down to become more of a mid-tone. And that will help isolate and amplify the bright light I want to save on the water in the midground there. So foreground, midground, background, dark, light, midtone. It's a pretty simple value arrangement, but it should work. Format I'm using, you could do this as a vertical image. It would give more emphasis to the sky and a bit more to the water, perhaps, depending on how you frame it. But I think in the long run, I want to emphasize the horizontal axis. So a horizontal formatted painting, I think, will tell this story a little bit better. It'll keep the viewer's attention down along the ground plane a little bit more. And I hope for this painting will make you have a bit of the experience I had of actually being there. So we'll just call this Evening in Central Park. Still March, so again, not spring yet, but it is coming. So this value diagram, if you want to call it that, I call it my design blueprint for my painting, will stay very nearby. I'll keep the reference photo, but really more off to the side. This is really what I go on when I start to paint the actual finished painting. I've started lightly the sketch here, just to not waste too much of your time. But the horizon line runs here, just above the distant shoreline. I'm standing a bit on a hill looking out over the lake, so we do see a bit more water surface than we would if I was standing right down at the shore. Paper. I'm using a rough surface, quarter sheet of Arches, bright white. So it is a bright white, very light surface. So it transmits about the maximum amount of light that you can hope for. It's a rough surface because I just much prefer it. Maybe I'll explain a little bit more why once I start painting. And it's a quarter sheet in size, so not very big, around 15 by 11 inches or so. I'm sketching with a Blackwing Palomino pencil. I love these. Just very expressive. Graphite pencil makes beautiful marks. It's my go-to sketch pencil. So here you see I'm sketching in some of these trees on this jut of land. I'm not really referring to the reference photo much, if at all, because I don't see any need that I have to copy the trees exactly as they show there. I want to be accurate to the spirit of this space, but I don't feel any need to be precise or identical to, I'm not doing tree portraits, if you understand what I mean. Generally, I think I love to draw, but I also am aware that I can overdraw my base drawings for my paintings sometimes a bit too much. So it's generally better to just indicate major elements, shapes of things, and then allow your brush once you start painting to imply the rest. The downside of drawing too much is that if you're not careful, you can begin to sort of paint by number and fill in the lines, and your resultant painting can look a little dry and stiff and technical, and I don't want that. If you want to do a drawing of this, that's another thing, which you can certainly do. But I think for painting in watercolor, I wish the whole feeling of this to feel very watercolor in nature. And of course by that I just mean fluid, loose, and expressive. So I just want to place the major elements. I'll be able to indicate the reflections easily enough, again, when I start painting. In the background, I started to lay in the profile of the San Remo, but again, I love to draw, and I just started to draw a little too much, and I was being a little too careful. And it's an evening view. These are not the focus point of the painting. So knowing that tells me it would be a mistake to over detail them or show too much. You just want them to read as this twin, these beautiful twin towers sticking up. Central Park West, as many of you probably know, is just lined with these classic old apartment buildings. The San Remo is one of the most famous. Built in the late 1920s, I think, roughly 1929 or 30, if memory serves. But again, it's got such a distinctive profile that I think for this painting, that's all that's going to be needed. And bear in mind, I want it to look far away. So as painters, ways we can make things look far away, we have many tools at our disposal. Less detail, less specificity, yes. Softer edges, yes, that'll help. Less saturation of color, less intensity of value. All these things can help something that's quite near to us in reality, two-dimensional, look much more three-dimensional just by the juxtaposition of the lightness and hopefully softness with which I will paint the towers, and then the crispness and dark values that I will use to paint the trees. And that should be plenty to imply that these are much closer than these. Again, when I say that, it almost sounds obvious, and it kind of is, or at least it's common sense. But once again, if we rely too heavily on the reference photos, we can forget that and go in and start to paint little windows and doors and be very specific and hard-edged about this, and almost without fail, that's a mistake if you want it to look far away and not the focal point of the painting. Oh yes, how to establish a focal point. It's almost always going to be in your painting. It doesn't have to be a point, I should point out. It could be an area, a band of interest. But anyway, a focal area or point in your painting is almost always going to be where the highest level of contrast occurs. I mean, there may be exceptions, but generally, where the lightest light of your painting, which will be here, meets the darkest dark, which will be here, that's going to create the focal point. It's the human eye will seek out that area of highest contrast just subconsciously. So as a painter, knowing that, you can use that and use it to your advantage and draw the viewer's eye where you want it to most go, or most quickly go, or to go first. That is probably enough drawing, actually. Again, I'm a bit guilty sometimes of overdrawing my work. It's best to just try to locate the major areas and shapes rather than any kind of identifying details for the most part. So overall, this is a relatively simple painting. Big shapes of mid-tone, big shapes of dark, and big areas of light. So the drawing, a little bit of drawing is necessary, but again, too much is not a good thing. I'm gonna even go in here and obscure some of these specific marks I made, but it should be fine. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is prep my palette, and then I'll be back to start the painting. I want to try to do this fairly quickly, loosely, and fluidly, so it should be easy enough to follow along, and I hope that you get some good bits of advice or tips, or not that I have answers necessarily, I just mean it's always good to see how other people approach paintings, and then it's up to you to say that's for me or that's not for me. Figuring out what we don't want is often just as important or more important than figuring out what we do want. So yeah, I'll be back with you in just a couple minutes.